Regardless of how you're interacting with Kubernetes, whether it's programmatically, whether it's through a Kubernetes style UI or GUI, whatever you want to call it, whether it's through YAML, whether it's imperative with kubectl, understand that regardless of what you're doing, you are always interacting with an API. So in this video, what I want to do is I just want to break down another way that you could even think about doing this with a programming language. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to use TypeScript. And with TypeScript, we have a way to interact programmatically with Kubernetes a couple of different ways. You can use the Kubernetes library, or because Kubernetes is literally just an API underneath the hood, you can interact with it directly like you would with an API. And there are libraries to do that as well. So there's one called Axios, and you can use that to interact directly with APIs. But in this case, there's a Kubernetes library in NPM that we can use. All right, so the first thing is we'll set up a constant and we'll call it k8s. And we're gonna set up a requirement here for Kubernetes client node. So instead of doing a standard import, we'll do it this way. And then what we can do is we can set up another constant for kubeconfig, and we'll initialize a new object here and say k8s kubeconfig. And then we will take the kubeconfig and we'll say load from default. And this is going to load the kubeconfig from the default location, which is .kubeconfig in your home directory. All right, one more constant here, and then we can get into the core functionality. We'll say rback v1 API, and we'll say kubeconfig dot make API client. We're going to call upon the Kubernetes package, and we'll use rback authorization v1 API. Okay, so real quick, what have we done so far? Well, we've called down the JavaScript package, right? And we would be doing this like if we were using Python, we'd be using Python package, and Go, we'd be using one of the Go libraries. And then we set up a new object initiation, and then we load the kubeconfig from the default location, which is in .kubeconfig in your local user directory. And then after that, we're setting up one more constant that's making an API call to rback authorization v1 API. So we're going to be setting up some rback permissions in here if you haven't already guessed it. All right, so let's go ahead and create a function. We'll call it rback create. No parameters are necessary. No return type is necessary. And then I'll say let rback create. This doesn't have to be a constant. It can just be a regular variable. rback v1 API create cluster role. All right, and now what we're gonna do is, you can see GitHub Copilot is already trying to help me out here, but I don't need its help. All right, so we're gonna set up some key value pairs here. And this is gonna be very similar to what we would be putting in our kubeconfig. Actually, arguably the same thing, just written in a different way. Oops, sorry. I need parentheses here, not brackets. All right, so we're gonna call upon rback v1 API, right? Because we're calling the rback authorization v1 API object or method. And then from there, we're calling a method called create cluster role. And then notice here how we're specifying the API version, the kind, metadata, and then the rules here. So again, this is very similar to what you would see in a standard Kubernetes manifest. Actually, let me see if I have one here. I might have one. Yeah, should have one here. Beautiful. Yep. So this actually mimics this. So you can see the verbs, resources, API groups, the name, API version, and the kind. Notice here, API version, kind, name, and then the verbs, resources, and API groups. So all this stuff mimics what we would see in a YAML manifest. And then what we'll do is we'll just call a quick console log so we can run this. And rback create, this is going to be the variable that contains all the information to create the role. And then we'll just call the function here. All right, cool. So now let's do tsnode, just because I'm running this locally. Tsnode is a way to run a TypeScript file locally. We'll say program k8s because that's where this currently exists, rback and rback.ts. All right, the output just shows that there's a promise in play. But if we run kubectl get cluster role and I scroll up, Notice how we now have reader, and we can look and confirm that that was in fact just created by us. A couple of different reasons for this video. Number one, just kind of cool to play around with, right? Give you another thing to program. Second thing is it shows us that really interacting with Kubernetes is no different than interacting with any other API. So hopefully this helped. Maybe it gave you another idea on how to programmatically interact with Kubernetes, and hopefully you had some fun.